Good afternoon. Thanks for joining this meetup session on automating PAN firewalls, Palo Alto Networks firewalls. Before I get started, just so I can kind of gauge where everybody is, you notice we have these emojis on the screen. If you've had experience in the past manually configuring either the PAN firewall directly or using Panorama, like their management software GUI, could you give me a thumbs up? Okay. And I guess there's not that many people on the call, so maybe firewalls on a Friday isn't the best idea. But Pan is the market leader, so I thought it was a good idea for that one. But for those of you who may not be as familiar with the firewall side of things, the intention of today is to keep it fairly simple on the firewall. So if you're not that familiar with firewalls in general, you'll see some of the basic configurations. Normally, just like any other networking device, we need to do some level of bootstrapping, to bring the device up and to configure. Yeah, firewalls on Friday. Yeah, so we need to do some level of configuration to bring up interfaces, host names, DNS, NTP. Those configurations that typically we need to get started, and then from that we can start building the other constructs that we use, leading towards security policies. So in this case, you'll see that we're going to set up some address objects and services, and we will create some firewall rules and some NAT policies. So those are kind of like basic, firewall features and functions. And in doing so, we'll be able to connect to a RHEL VM that has SSH and port 80 available to us, so we can test to see that our firewall actually works. So I'll table some of that for now because I'll show you a diagram of what you're actually connecting to. But before I do that, I wanted to give you a little bit of a backdrop of what we're doing with the collection itself. So let me just go back to the beginning here. And if you're not aware, Palo Alto for PANOS has had a collection for a while, but it was a community collection rather. So in that particular format, it supports the firewall and also Panorama. For my purposes for the lab setting, there's really no reason for me to use the Panorama because I can configure these devices and automate them directly. So that's kind of the premise of this. But you could use this collection to access the REST API of the management as well. We're actually connecting directly to the firewall, which also uses a REST API, and there is a GUI, but it's per firewall. So we'll use that GUI to validate the changes that we're making as well, so that we can actually visually see the updates and things that different elements that we're either configuring or deleting or changing. We'll be able to see that in real time. So in terms of the collection, I mentioned it's been available in Galaxy, but more recently it is now a certified collection. So the difference there is in Galaxy, you could install the collection. You can install it locally on any device that you're running the Ansible core engine, and you can run it in your virtual environment using Ansible-playbook commands or Ansible, like to directly access the modules, and it works in that context. But it also works using Ansible Navigator, which is something that we're going to see today in this demo. But if you stay on for the second half for the study group, we're going to go through a lab, and it's basically just that, like how do you use the Ansible Navigator. So you'll see me using it in this particular demo, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time drilling down into the underpinnings of the Ansible Navigator. So we'll kind of table that, and then if you stay in the study group, or if you want to watch it later in the video replay, then you'll see more of the deep dive into not just how you use the Navigator, but different configuration settings and how you can customize it for your purpose. But what you will notice, and when we go through the demo, I'm using the Navigator, which is not using a collection that's locally installed on my laptop. The collection is actually installed in an execution environment, which is a container. So that's a topic that we'll sort of touch on in the study group in this session, but more in passing. But we'll circle back and we'll actually go through more exercises to learn how can you create your own execution environments and work with the ones that are available for you. And that kind of dovetails back to the certified collections, where in order to access them, you would have to have a subscription for the Ansible automation platform. So kind of the difference there is the collection that's available in Galaxy is provided with contributors from Palo Alto and other third party that they use in that context. But for the certified collection, there's additional steps, if you will, and rigor in testing that collection and making it comply with our ecosystem in the direction that we're going with automation in general, in terms of what modules need to be available in a collection and other requirements, such as documentation, additional testing, like I mentioned, any other dependencies and plugins and filters and those types of things that have a wrapper together in the collection or associated roles. All of that stuff is available for you, not from Galaxy, but you would pull that down from the console, from the automation hub, and you would, in practice, you would use them in your private automation hub. So that's something that I'm just mentioning now, but we're going to go in more details later in the study group when we get more into the like the low level details of the Ansible automation platform and controller and the private automation hub. And if you viewed a couple of these other sessions, like when I did validated content, we had to use the private automation hub for that particular one. So I kind of went in detail there, but there's a lot of information to unpack, and we'll definitely spend we'll do our giving that particular topic its justice later. But I just wanted to point out that that's where the certified content lives. In terms of installing it, like I'm using an execution environment, and you'll see how I'm pulling it down from a registry. For the documentation, I just wanted to provide this link, and don't worry about the links as we go through, because I'm going to provide a PDF of the PowerPoint, which will have all these same links in it. And you'll be able to go back and have access to them in the past event. So if you go back, like next week or whatever, you'll see all the links to whatever we cover today. But I wanted to show you in the documentation effectively what's in the collection. So these are all the various modules, and I mentioned that because Palo Alto is now certified, they've started to refactor and add to the previous collection and modules, and they're becoming more in line with what you would expect to see, not just in firewalls, but across all the network devices. So if you recall, when we were doing the access list 2 weeks ago, we were using resource modules. And a big component of the resource modules were the newer states that they provide. So there's a notion of merging a config, so that state doesn't actually remove any of the existing configs. But then we had other options available in our resource modules, like replaced, overwrite, delete, and we had gathered, so we can gather the facts specifically for that configuration that's represented in that particular module, that resource module. So you'll notice that those same constructs are being added into the Palo Alto collection. So what you'll find is that you'll see some of like the legacy stuff is there and newer. So it's kind of at a state where a lot of these will still work, but at some point in time, the direction would be that the older ones become deprecated, and that would be called out in the documentation. And then the newer features and functions would be available with all the consistent naming and states. And the good news there is that when you work with a firewall, it's going to look a lot like a router or a switch or a load balancer. And when you're working across vendors, if I'm working on a Cisco ASA V, if you from a legacy perspective, Because those have resource modules, it'll look a lot like a Palo Alto. But just keep in mind that it'll look a lot alike for those common things that firewalls do. But for anything that's more proprietary and unique, then that's where you'll see modules that are kind of outside of like the resource modules that kind of cover that, or you would go back to more of the non-abstracted types of modules for like configs and commands and those types of things. So what I wanted to do was go ahead and show you what we're going to do. So this is a basic topology. And I didn't have time to put the exact IP addressing back into this diagram, but it gives you the high level view of what we're going to do. So one of the components is the automation controller. So that's sitting in Amazon, in AWS. So it's there, and I have access to it. From a management perspective. I also have my laptop, and I'm running the Ansible Navigator on my laptop. So I'm remote from the Palo Alto firewall, which is coincidentally also sitting in AWS. So the firewall is a virtual firewall, and it has three different interfaces. So one interface is a management interface, and that's the one that I'm connecting to or will connect to with my automation, as well as when we want to verify anything from the GUI, we're going to connect to the management interface. Moving forward, and as we configure and bootstrap the device, we're going to set up two additional interfaces. So one of those is an untrusted interface that's meant to be the front end for policy for this RHEL virtual machine that's sitting behind the firewall. So there's a public IP address here that we can access, but it really only gives us connectivity after we create the security policies. So in other words, we're going to open up, ports and make that available from the outside to the RHEL virtual machine. And we're also going to need a NAT policy because we have a public IP address out here on Untrust, and then we have a private IP as part of the VPC connection behind the firewall. So this emulates in a basic way, right? Because normally you would have two firewalls for high availability. It emulates using, a third-party vendor's firewall as opposed to the native capabilities in AWS. So what are the native capabilities? So there's other, options to spin up, other types of firewalls and things like that. But you do have your security groups, and those can be implemented in front of devices as well that kind of give you some level of security in AWS between the outside and the inside. But it doesn't give you all the visibility and additional, threat protection and so on and so forth of the capabilities of like a real firewall. So a lot of times you'll see those added into these environments to create like a cloud DMZ, if you will. So that's what we have here. And there's a repository. This link will become available for you, and you'll see this used. This is all the playbooks and config files and anything else that we're using, like the inventory. All of that is included in this repo. And you would be able to rebuild this if you have an AWS environment, or if you're spinning up a Palo Alto in your own lab. You would be able to do so. It's just that you would have different connectivity options for you to actually access the firewall. But I'm not automating any of that. It assumes that you've created your infrastructure around the firewall, which we could have automated, but to keep that kind of generic, it's just starting from the point that we have the working firewall, the PAN firewall. So having said that, I believe that's really all I wanted to cover a slide perspective, and these are just some links. And as I mentioned, I'm going to add some additional links to this as well of anything that we go over. So I'm going to go ahead and show you over here. I have my VS Code, and let me open up the Explorer so you can see these are the files that are in my project. So these align with the what I mentioned, from the repo as well. So if I go back to the repo here, this is the GitLab repo. So it's the same files right now. We have everything is in sync. So like if I do git status here, you can see that we're working on the same main branch as GitLab, and everything's the exact same. in terms of the Git repository. So one of the things that I wanted to show you before we get started, and kind of circle back to what we mentioned with the modules. So if we look at the playbooks here, I have 4 different playbooks. One is just a gathering facts, and this is not like facts from like a server. So it's not the gather underscore facts. These are the like the PANOS facts, similar to like iOS facts and EOS facts. These are the specific facts that are gathered from the firewall device and pulled down. So that's another area that's consistent with what you would find in the current collections as part of the ecosystem. So that works the same, just like it does with routers and so on. It'll have magic variables, which are the the canned variable names for interfaces and things like that. And we'll take a look at that one here in a few minutes. This one here, the pan config, this would config everything that I mentioned, but we're not going to do that all in one cycle. We're going to break it down. So one way that we can actually decouple these from each other, even when they're in a common playbook, is using tags. So we're going to use tags here from the playbook, and you'll notice that these tasks in this play, they're really only calling a role, right? So it's iterating through these roles, and you'll notice that like in initial setup, we have a tag of interfaces. We could have named, it's arbitrary, we could have named it anything, but interfaces is a big part of that initial setup, is setting up those other 2 interfaces and making them enabled and available with IP addresses and so on and so forth. So that's one of the things that we're doing in that initial step in this playbook. So all of that is really happening in the role. So that's in this folder in roles. So if I go to the initial setup, then this is where the magic is, right? Where we're doing the configurations. And those configurations are drawn from modules. So each one of these is a Palo Alto PANOS module. And we're iterating through these using loops, because we have more than one item that we're configuring at a time. So that's how this is set up. Now, this is assuming that we want to create like a complete configuration for our zones, and then later for our security rules and for our NAT policies. But if we want to make it more granular, we can do that as well. And we can break up, and we could create additional roles and then further decouple those and make them even more modular. So here you can see that there's, in some cases, there's several parameters that we're setting, but we could even break those up. And the reason I bring that up is because if we look at security rules here, I might want to create something more specific to like a rule name. And then in that rule name, I may want to modify specifically the rules. So I can make that more granular, as opposed to here where it's configuring that entire security policy. I may want to break that down further, and that would be more not for like building configurations, but for modifying configurations. So I just wanted to point out that this one's a little bit more generic. It's configuring like an entire security role and multiple of those for having access in different directions. So that is happening because in our host vars, what we have here is a configuration file for our PANOS-firewall is the name of the firewall. And I probably should let me walk this back a minute. So these are all of the configs that we're defining as variables, or these are the configs that would populate our variables. So if we look at our inventory, if we start from the inventory, all I have is a group called all, because I'm only connecting to this one firewall. So this is not a great example of an inventory, but for all intents and purposes, that's all this demo really is ever going to be, unless I add like a second firewall. Then I would need to create a group, and then I would have 2 hosts under that group. But for right now, it's just a PANOS-firewall. So one way to present a configuration that we'll use to populate those variables that we need to define in our roles is in a host vars. So in host vars, you name it the name of that host. And this is just a YAML file. And you can see I have different sections here for different purposes. So this is device config is like those initial configs. So we're going to configure like DNS, and we're going to go in and further down, you'll have the interface information. So here's objects. So one of the things that we do when we work with like even networks with access list or with firewalls is we use objects, and then usually object groups, so that we can organize things easier and then repurpose names, as opposed to having to remember like IP addresses, and it just makes it easier to organize everything. So this one's pretty simple. We just have address objects and service objects, and services would align to like the ports that we're going to open in our security policies. And then we have the security policy. So there's a lot of config in those. That's why I mentioned this is a good one to probably make this a little bit more modular if we just want to edit like components, subsections of parameters within a security rule. This is like kind of the whole thing, like across the board for security rule. And then we do need routing. So for our NAT to work, we have some static routes. And then we have our NAT policies, which is another one that has a lot of a config as well. So those are our configs that we're going to run through our roles. So back to the playbook, and before I launch this, I'm gonna show you this one. Facts is like a really simple one, and it's a good one to use to see like what are the existing configurations. But at this point, we really don't have much of a configuration. So if I take a look at what we have right now, I could open up a tab here, and we'll log into the firewall. So this is that GUI I mentioned. And get rid of these pop-ups. So one of the things at this point that we don't have, or we shouldn't have, is any of the network setup, right? So you can see that there's no link state. There's no active interfaces that we're using other than the management. The management is there already. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to connect to the GUI, right? So zones. So we have a dependency on zones so that we can create our policies and our NAT. So we have no zones at the moment. We will have an untrusted and trusted that we'll add into the firewall. In virtual routers, we can use the default, just like any network device, right? You can either use a default or you can create your own new VRFs. There are no static routes at the moment, and there's no policies, right? So security policies, just the default ones that are already in there. And the same thing, nothing in NAT. So for all intents and purposes, we have a firewall that's not really able to do anything at the moment. And what we're going to test later too is open up another tab. And I mentioned we have a web service on port 80 running, but we shouldn't be able to connect anything right now. So it's not. This is the public IP that'll be on the that external interface on the firewall, and then we'll NAT from that. But right now we can't connect to it. So if we go back to our firewall, we'll kind of take advantage of the tabs, and then or tag. I say tabs. The tags. We'll take advantage of the tags, and then we'll delete the config in the controller. We're going to look at the Ansible automation controller, and I'll show you like how we run it from there as opposed to the Ansible navigator. And it's pretty simple. It's really just the credentials are a little bit different. And we'll run it from there to delete everything, and then we'll run a workflow as opposed to like manually running all these playbooks. Then we can create a workflow that'll stitch together the playbooks and give us the ability to insert conditions. So we can have pass, fail, or always conditions that we run based off of what the response is back from our playbooks. And those are implemented through job templates and through a workflow. And we'll go through that in more detail. So from the first one that I wanted to show you that's not really going to do anything is, well, it'll show us some information, the facts, but we don't have a whole lot configured at this point. So if you recall from when we used the navigator before, and we'll do some more of this in the study group, the run command is how we run the playbooks from the navigator. So that one, what's in under playbooks, right? And then if we want to see it in standard output, then we put it in that mode. Otherwise, it's going to be a part of a GUI, which is just like a menu-driven option, and we'll see that in the study group in more detail as well. So let me move this up. Oh, something happened. In here, did I change something while I was messing around? I mean, that shouldn't matter. Like most of these are just from the Ansible lint, so it's pretty picky about that stuff, but that's not like a syntax thing. Just make sure I didn't accidentally type anything in here while I was talking. Hmm. All right, come back this one. I'm gonna check another one out just to make sure that it's not in this. Here we go. And config. I don't want to do the whole thing. So tags, interfaces. Yep. Character 0. I'm not even in where I want to be. It's a damn problem. Line 6. Oh, wait a minute. I got it. I did move something, a space at some point. So device, right? And so we'll try the fax one again. Sorry about that. Old eyes. Yeah, there we go. If you see me do something dumb, just let me know. I don't realize when I added that space, but it got in there. So this is fax. So the particular fax that we're looking at, let me bring this one up here, is the subset of all, but not the config. And the reason why I took the config out is because it's like this big, it's a blob of data. with new lines and stuff, and it's not the easiest thing to look at. So I remove that one by having an exclamation point or bang. So this means not the config, and this will be everything else but the config. So this is everything that the firewall has configured at the moment. So it does have a name, right? The PA dash, oh, that's the model. I'm sorry, PA dash VM. The name should be in here somewhere. Interfaces. There it is. Here's the name. The name was already configured. And then most of this is just basic information about the firewall. But there's not a whole lot in there. So we'll run this again. There'll be a lot more information after we actually configure some stuff. So let's go ahead and configure some things. All right, so the first thing was the interfaces. This is all the container too, that it's pulling down that execution environment. That's why you see that on the screen. So it's green because it already had the name, but it's changing these. That's why it's yellow or yellowish. These are actually being changed. These zones are new. The management profile was in there from earlier because we had to connect to it. The interfaces here are coming up. We have an untrust on the front of the firewall and a web on the back end. And then this commit here is because these interfaces do not work until you commit that config. So once it commits, then they'll actually be up and running. So if we go back into here and look in interfaces, you can see that they're not up yet, but they're configured. And we don't have like all the information yet either, like the DHCP. So if I go back here, it's still going through the commit. This could take like a minute or so. And that's just like when you command line change stuff or whatever, it just takes it a minute to commit those changes in the firewall. And it might just be because it's a smaller VM too, it takes a little bit longer. But once that's done, so now it's done, I can reload or refresh that page, I mean. Seems like everything's slow. Yeah, see they're up and running now. Some of the other stuff that was initial is also configured and committed, so that's there. So the next thing is we didn't have any objects yet, or we still don't have our static routes. That was a dependency as well. In a firewall, or at least in this type of firewall, you can't add the static routes until after you have the interfaces enabled. So now it's a good like next step to do that stuff. So if I go back here, and I just have to change the tags. So the next one is objects. And while this one's working, I wanted to show you in the actual, I'll let this run here, then I'll go back here. I wanted to show you in the actual roles something. So like routes, for instance. See how it has a state of default omit? I'm not providing it with a state as a variable right now because there's a default. And the default is that the config is in the state of present. So it's the same thing as merged, which is confusing when you go, or a little bit confusing when you go to this documentation now. So if I go into the one for interfaces, let me just, or actually, I thought I just saw it. Is it this one? And you scroll down into the documentation to where it has the states. It has present default, so I don't have to explicitly state that. It's understood. But merged and present are kind of the same thing. So why are they both in there? Present is the old nomenclature. Just like absent is the exact same thing as deleted. But these you have to explicitly change them right from the default. So when I run those same roles with deleted or absent, it'll remove those configs. So that's how we can clean back out our config. either just sections of it using the tags or the whole entire, like the entire playbook run kind of in reverse. And then we have these other states like replaced. That's very useful for firewalls, just as it was with access lists, because that's where we can go in and we can replace like those. In this case, it would be the individual rule entries. Just like we could go into an access list and modify an individual ACE or like one access list entry as part of an access list, and we can point to it by name, or we could have point to it by its sequence number. So we showed replace was very valuable in that regard. You could do something like that with the firewalls as well. So these are like newer states. It used to only have the present and absent, and then it started adding these other ones. And then gathered is new too. So gathered, I can go to that specific configuration and pull it out. And we'll do that. We'll use gathered in the workflow as well. So let me go back, and we can see that it finished that one for the objects. And just to validate real fast, now if I go over here, we have the web object. That's the Rails server that we're going to access the web page in SSH. And then we also had some services that we created. So the web ones, HTTP and HTTPS, were already available. They're just the pre-can ones that are a part of all the other pre-can configs in the firewall. We added these. So we created a service for the regular SSH port 22, and then we created 221 and 222. So that way we could do some port forwarding if we want to use a different port on the outside, and then we can map it to 22 on the inside, so we don't have to change the server. If we wanted to change the server to another port, we could do that as well. So that's where we would work with our services to do that type of thing. And these are available now for our policies. So these are kind of like a prerequisite for the policies in so much as we can organize them, into these objects. So we'll go back here, and then we're going to do policies. That one will run for a minute. So if we go over here into roles, and then we have routes, objects, routes, initial commit. Security rules, this one. So we have our security rules. So in this one, we required a zone that we've already built, so that's good. And we're also going to use for, where we're going to connect to will be to that. That's actually in the NAT policy. We'll use that that object, that address object. So we go back to roles, and I want to see NAT. So here is the NAT policy that we'll iterate through. So with that in mind, this is the output of iterating through those variables. So security rules and the NAT rules. So all that, if you recall, was from our host vars. So I'm just trying to keep going through here so you can see the patterns. So here's the security policy. So we iterated through these configs. We had a rule called SSH 22 inbound, so we can get to that server from port 22 using the service TCP 22 that we created earlier in the previous step. Web browsing. We already had the port 80 available for us, so that was already created and prepackaged. And then that'll give us access to that same server inbound for web. And then allow all outbound is for that Rails server has the ability, or it's allowed to go anywhere outbound. We're not preventing it in any way. It can go to any destination on the untrusted side, which would be on the internet side. So this one's done. So that was the last one. And then we have this gathered and delete, but I'm going to run those from the controller. So there's no need of seeing them twice. And then in the controller, we're going to run this facts again too, so we can see all the additional facts that we picked up from the additional configurations. So before we do that, let's just make sure that we see our policies in here, which we should. So here's the NAT that we just talked about. And then these are the security rules that allow for the access. So those were created. We could also ping too. So I forgot that one. So at this point, we should be able to access that server now. So if I bring this back up and reload it, and this is just a basic, web server that's running on that real VM that only has a private IP address. So the only way it gets out on the internet is through the firewall, and the only way to access it is through the firewall. And the firewall is running in AWS, and that real server sitting behind it, but on a private network on a VPC. The other thing is we're supposed to be able to SSH to it as well. So this IP right here is the public IP to that rel. So if I jump down here into VS Code, this is a key. I need a key to be able to log into it. But what I forgot to do is the -I. What am I doing? Oh, okay. It's a / .ssh. And so here's the key. And then ec2-user at that IP address. All right, so now I'm on that rel box through the firewall. And just to show you, it's the same one where we were accessing that web page. I can just curl that web page. Right, and it's the same thing. So that's access. So that kind of shows you how we broke it down from a playbook and the roles that it's calling. There's a lot of info in the roles, right? I just kind of glanced on that. But again, you'll have the repo if you want to go back through it. But most of it is very similar in the way that I'm using loops. And I'm just iterating through those configs that are defined in the host vars. And it's just the difference between them is really the module, right? So when you go into the roles, that's where you can see what module we're actually using in each one. So just to go back real quick to objects here. And if you're interested, then like for the address objects, you can just grab this, the name of the module, and like I opened up the documentation earlier over here. At the top of all this, you can just search through it and find it directly. And just take that colon out the back. And this will define like all the parameters that you can set. And then usually, or in most cases, there should always be an example. And sometimes there's multiple examples that show you in practice how you would be able to use these. So you can go through and use these as kind of a starting point in addition to the repo. So let's go into our Ansible automation platform controller. And I'm going to log in real quick. We're almost done too. And we'll make that change over to the study group. But before we do that, I'm definitely going to pause for questions and stuff too. So it is Pan as a user, the right password in here. So I'm logging in as a particular user that has limited access because of roles-based access. All I can see is Pan firewall job templates. Earlier I mentioned job templates, they just map to playbooks. And what's cool about this is if you're using tags, in your job template, you can also use tags. So I'm just copying over that same playbook and just it's a different tag that I'm pointing to. So to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, I'll go into pan initial and I'm not able to go into the config because I didn't give access to make changes for this user. So this is a good example of the roles, right? So an admin can actually modify. So I go in as an admin now, I can edit. Now here's where the tag is, interfaces, just like we did when we ran it from Navigator. And then some of the other information is the inventory. So the inventory is sourced from my GitLab repo over here. So I pull this inventory down from this host file, which is just that one host, but we're ingesting that inventory. And then the other thing is my host vars too. Those come down with the repo, and then we have access, to everything we've defined here. Now, you may have this question: how the heck do I log in? Because I'm not explicitly providing my username or my password for the Palo Alto. So when I was running it locally, I have another folder in group vars that I'm using to log in, but I use a .git ignore so that doesn't go into the repo. So when I update those files and commit them and push them into the repo, it doesn't send my credentials out, right? Because I'm creating like a filter that doesn't allow them to go out. But that's how I'm locally. It's there locally on my machine, so I'm able to log in that way. In the controller, that's remote from me, right? So I don't have credentials that are a part of the repository. It's just this variable, Ansible user and Ansible password. And then if they're not here, if it's empty, that's okay. It won't error out if it goes through here because it just has a default omit. But where they're actually coming from is a credential in the controller. So credentials, you configure them and they're encrypted and they're only, accessible in the controller. Or you could have an integration into something external from AAP, like CyberArk or HashiCorp or something else where you're managing your credentials. But it's the same point. It's like the credentials are just used by AAP when you run through these job templates, and they're encrypted. So it's just like Vault. So locally, I could use Vault and I could encrypt my credentials and decrypt them for the running of the playbook. But the file is always encrypted. So that's another method that we could have used. So there's a credential that's in my job templates. So I was able to show you like how we can go in to edit, but now I'm going to go back as that user, Pan. Bear with me a second. All right, so I'm logged in as Pan. When this user goes into credentials, it can only see one credential, and that's the one that we're using for Palo Alto. So this one I can't edit though. So I have access to it to use it, but I can't go in, the administrator, or I'd have to give the Pan user, elevate their privileges so that they can go in and mess with the credentials. So this is a user that can access and execute automation, but they can't go in and change anything, and they're not able to like do anything in terms of the credentials either. So they only have access to them. So that's all defined in teams and roles, and then adding users into roles. So that's something that would take a little bit longer to go through, but we definitely will cover that at some point. We'll go in great detail of setting up roles-based access. But that's why I can't actually get to some of these, because I don't need to. I'm more of an automation administrator in this context, so I don't have to have access to everything. And if I do, I just bump back out as an admin. So I'm going into templates, and one of the ones is initial. And kind of long story short, the job template points to a playbook. And then I showed you when we were able to go into the edit that we have a tag that's going to interfaces, just like we did when we were on the navigator. So hopefully that makes sense. So when I run this, it would do the same thing. It's only going to run those first configurations that are needed to bring up the interfaces and some of the other configs that were in there along with that. And then it would commit the config. But we're not going to run it like that. What I want to show you is a workflow. So this is a workflow. In a workflow, I stitch together multiple job templates, and I can provide conditions. So the way that this works is the green is pass, the red is fails, and a blue is always, regardless if it passes or fails. So this is all linear, right? But I could have like parallel stages that are running at the same time. So these workflows can become very complicated. And a workflow, instead of a job template, can have another workflow nested underneath of it. So they can become, very complicated in terms of orchestration capabilities. So this one is the same one with the interfaces, and then we did objects, and then we did the policies, which were the security policies and the NAT policies. And then gathered, we didn't run earlier, but what this is going to do is go to the firewall and just pull in the configuration data for how we set up the NAT and the security policies, because I'm only running it against those. And then the pan facts gives us all the other information, like additional stuff, like the interfaces that we configured, the routing table stuff. A lot of that is in the facts that it gathers, so we'll be able to see that as well. So when I run this here, it'll create a job and a notification. That's what this is. These notifications are set up in Slack, but you could use any chat tool that has an API. So all the main ones like Microsoft and WebEx and whatever, you can use those to notify your job. So everything's mapped to a job, and it has a cross link, right? So if I go into this one here, it'll bring up, that was to the workflow, but each one has like a different link. So if I would have clicked on one of the other earlier ones, it would have went to this. So I can get to those directly from here as well. So I can find them in here. So the first one was the workflow that I clicked on. We want to see what's going on in this pan initial. It's at this stage. But you know what? I screwed up. Let me go back to jobs. And if you want to stop the whole thing, you go to workflow. And you can stop it here. I'm going to go ahead and stop it because what I wanted to do is I want to delete everything because we had built everything earlier. So if I go to templates and go to pan delete, and I'm going to run that one, but without a tag. So it's going to go through all of them and delete using the state of delete. It's going to remove those configs. So that's just another notification for that in this job number. So I kicked that one off. So while that's running, let me show you what we did in terms of deleting. So go to playbooks. So we've been in config. Here's the delete. So in delete, it's effectively the same thing, but in the reverse order. So I had some dependencies before. When you're building the firewall, you need interfaces first. And then after interfaces, you need static route rules, because they're a dependency for your NAT to work later. So after you have those, then you can build your security policies in your NAT. So you kind of go in a order and commit so that these configs become active for the functions that you're building in the firewall. And in reverse order, when you're deleting it, there's dependencies, right? So you can't just rip the interfaces out when there's policies and static routes pointing to them, right? So you kind of go in the reverse order. So that's what I'm doing here is I can take the policies out, then the objects, and then hit the and the objects had the static routes in them, and then hit the firewall interfaces last. So that's what's going on right now. So to see what's going on, go to jobs. All right, and we're just running that one job template. So where are we at right now? We did the net rules. We're in the objects and the routes. And then the last part will be the interfaces, but that'll give us a clean slate. And if we check it out right now and refresh this thing, we can validate that it's actually gutting our config. Come on. All right, so boom. So our policies here, right? So they're gone. Our objects were like the services ones are gone because these are the built-in ones. We took out the SSH ones that we created. And then our address ones, it was a web, and that's gone. And then what's up with the network? So right now with the network, that's still there. Zones are gone, but the interfaces, so it must be like just about done. Let me go to here and refresh it. Yeah, so it's on that last candidate config to commit it. I wish that was a little bit quicker. Come on. We're still waiting for it to finish. That's the one that we canceled earlier. That's what that warning is. Okay, cool. All right, so now that's done. We got our notification. So I go to templates, workflow, launch it, and now it's going to build these guys. So while this is running, because again, it's going to want to do the commit and all that. Before we wrap this up and go into the study group, in the study group, we're going to go through the navigator. So these were kind of timely because they complement each other. But before we do that, and while we're still waiting on this stuff, does anybody have any questions regarding any of the PAN firewall stuff? Or any of the Ansible stuff that we just went through? Or really anything that we can talk about for like another couple of minutes while this finishes off? Does anyone have a joke?
Well, I could probably throw something in there. It's unrelated. Well, it's somewhat related. If you if that's all right, Tony. I don't want to
Okay.
interfere with the your presentation. But I reached out to you about dynamic inventory polling from Orion a
Yeah.
few days ago. I
Yeah.
actually wrote a Python script
Oh, cool.
to extract that info via API. Finally got it to work. Um, how would you, so on Tower or your automation controller there,
Mhm.
is the custom script still an option to add your, say, Python script in the actual automation controller so you can dynamically pull your inventory into the controller? Is that still, and I noticed that there's a message on the Ansible documentation that was depreciated, the old custom
Yeah.
script feature.
Yeah. So it is different now because we've got that execution environment.
Oh, okay.
So I believe the way that it's going to have to work is that Python script's going to have to become a part of your project. But I think they like really the best way to do it is to turn it like into a collection that you have access to. So that could just be. Are you?
Oh.
Do you have the private automation hub?
I do not yet, no, sir.
But you have the controller. Are you doing it just from that? Like, where are you working from
Right
currently?
now, I'm just working off a Linux or a Ubuntu desktop workstation, and I don't have Navigator either. I'm still back at the old Ansible Dash playbook days.
Yeah, yeah, because the tower used to use local file system in the same like virtual environments that you would run your core engine from.
Oh,
So
okay.
now we have this execution environment, which the navigator is kind of like the command line tool that can connect or leverages that container, but your core engine's running in a container. So
Hmm.
the way that you have access to like plugins and things is different because you have to like build them using a tool called Ansible Builder, to have them a part of your execution environment where you can have access to it. So some of these scriptings and things did change because of that, that architecture. So I'd have to find you like a good step by step type of thing to go through that last part so that you can have
Oh,
it implemented in a way that you'd be able to use. But like if you're just running it like directly from core engine, then you could find like the older way of just running it as a script.
oh, okay.
It's
Very
just you won't
good.
have the GUI part of it, because you would need to go through the EE to get to the controller. So
Right.
that's where it's a little bit different. It's the same thing like I was doing backups to Git repositories and things like that. I'm
Yep.
going to go over that next session, and there's like, okay, now that it's not localized completely, how do you do it through the execution environments? So everything's a little bit different through the execution environments because it's a container.
Sure. Sure. That makes sense. Thank you.
But yeah. So the good news is that it gives you a better architecture to work with. It's just there's always those nuances because it was everything before was just local to where you ran
Yeah,
the tower from.
yeah, very cool.
But I'll look into that part. If you want to share like your script too, I can try to get it to work. I
Oh
just
yeah, I
don't
can
have
share that.
I could just work like from the data, like if you have the data that you pulled out or something you could change that's like, in that format. I
Hmm.
just don't have the Orion. I don't know if I can get that for free or not to play with it. I'm not sure. I haven't looked into that in a long
It,
time.
it's interesting, but I think it'd be useful. If not the tower, I hope that I can maybe modify the Ansible config to use as an inventory source, maybe
Mhm.
locally.
Yeah, once you get it in that JSON format, it's just like a matter of you do want it really to be dynamic where it goes and looks every time.
Hmm.
Or do you like kind of have like a step in between where harness it out, turn it into the JSON that you can use it, and that is where it goes into your repo, and that's the source for your project, to update that inventory.
I
So
would I would prefer it to be dynamic or at least on a polling interval.
yeah, so that one you want to get your Python script working such that it's like a plugin.
Sure, sure, that makes
And
sense.
yeah, so that part we'll have to kind of dig in on that one a little bit. But I think everything just went through, so I want to just check real quick because I got a notification came in. Let me see if this one's done. Yeah, everything is done. So it did run here. I go to my jobs. Like everything ran through that workflow. And if I click on the workflow, I should have all like everything's green. Now, what if it did fail? So what I have set up here is an approval step. So sometimes I'll add like a rollback, which would just be like another job template with a playbook that would execute a rollback depending on what type of device it is. This one here is an approval. So when you click on these, and this one's already done, so I can't click on it. What it'll do is it'll ask you if you want to approve that step, or do you want to decline it or cancel the workflow? Because what happens is you can't move on to the next step until someone acknowledges the approval. And what this could be is just like troubleshooting whatever went wrong and fixing it, and then you go ahead and accept it, and then you move on to the next step. So that may be automated or it may be manual, but the workflow is unable to move forward and until it's resolved. So that's just one approach for that. But you could do whatever you want for this condition if it fails. But you can add notifications like I did, all that kind of stuff. There's failed. I had success notification or start, success, and fails. So these are just different options for the workflow. And just to make sure everything's good, we can go back here and let me close the tab just in case it's cached or something and open up a new one. And that is this. Yeah, so we're able to get there. And then earlier I was over here. I thought I went from, I don't want to type. What's going on with my terminal? Because I got locked out of the connection when we changed it. Now I see what's going on. How does it? Oh, I have to actually kill it here. New terminal. Shouldn't have two virtual environments, right? So now I'm back to that. That's not the right IP. One ring, EC2-user at this. Yeah, so we're all good. So that concludes that piece. And I'm over here, so I'm going to stop the recording. Where did I do that at? Stop recording.